Hi, folks. It's so great to be here with you all today at NACIS, wherever you may be, whether that is from the comfort of your own home or in person in Oklahoma City. As of the time of this recording, the September 30th, I don't know if I'm going to actually be in Oklahoma City or not. So regardless, I'm always available via email or Twitter, or I'll also be in the Slack channels as well if you want to talk to me some more. So it's great to kind of see everyone, and I hope you're having a good NACIS conference so far. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about queer maps and mapping queerly. It's a subject that I've grown increasingly passionate about over the past couple of years. And it started all the way back in the pre-pandemic in spring of 2019. So I was in the master's program at the University of Kentucky, and there was this queer geographies class that was being offered, and I said, you know what, I'm going to take it. It's not really my interest. I don't really know, why. I'll just do it. And while I was out as a gay man, to not only to my family and friends and my coworkers, I was not necessarily out in a professional sense. And so by that, I mean, people knew that I was gay. I wasn't hiding it or anything like that, but I definitely didn't study any queer topics. Wasn't necessarily interested in the way in which queer people think about space, conceptualize space, and how that space is ultimately mapped. And this seminar really changed that for me. It really allowed me to realize that thinking about queer folks is, especially in the context of cartography, is tremendously important to understanding and advancing kind of the larger diversity of cartography. So there were two key questions that came out of that seminar. And the first one is, where are all the queer cartographers? We know that there are a number of them who are active now, but we know that historically there had to have been some. And so who were they? What did they do? And where are all the maps that depict queer subjects? You don't see those that often, but they have to exist somewhere. And so since 2019, the topic of queer maps and queer mapping has really quite taken off, which has really been exciting. So it's taken off not only in the larger cartography community and in the geography community, but even in fashion mainstream, such as Dan Levy's recent Met Gala outfit, which, as you can tell, has two men kissing, and that, as they are depicted by maps. So queer mapping is basically everywhere these days. And so some of the earliest thinking about queer maps comes all the way back in 2008, when Michael Brown and Larry Knopp authored this pretty influential article, came out in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers, entitled Queering the Map. And so in it, they talk about the tensions that are inherent between the process of collecting data for a map and actually making a map. So they talk about how, well, we know what buttons to click and how to make a map that actually people can read and understand, but how do we show ambiguity? How do we show the fact that some of these places were more important to some people than others? How do you kind of show that on a map? And since then, there hasn't been a significant amount of interest in queer cartography, especially in terms of literature. So one of the most recent ones comes from the individual who taught that queer geographies class here at Kentucky, Dr. Jack Easking, whose recent article that came out essentially envisions the idea of mapping queer urban space as like mapping constellations and mapping stars. So much in the same way we know the Earth spins, we know the Earth is rotating around the sun, we know that there are various things that get in our way to view stars and whatnot, and the stars themselves are changing. And the process of trying to map out the stars is difficult and filled with all sorts of issues. And similarly, so is trying to map queer space and map it in a way that is fair and equitable. And so outside of these kind of more theoretical interventions, there have also been a number of new digital projects that have popped up. The first is one of the most significant is called Querying the Map. It's a user-generated, user-contributed map where queer folks are allowed to essentially click on a place that's significant to them and say why it's significant. Others seek to map the past, such as mapping the gay guides, which has taken what you see in the lower right-hand corner, a series of gay travel guides, and essentially geocoded all of the locations in those travel guides to map them out to figure out where they were and how they changed over time. And so with Jack Eastking support, with a lot of Jack Eastking support, in fact, he and I put together a panel called Querying the Map 2.0, where we looked at interactivity, temporality, and ambiguity in queer digital maps. There's a YouTube link to it there. I encourage you to go check it out. It's a really great conversation. At least I think it's a really great conversation with a number of really innovative queer cartographers who are doing a lot of work mapping queer spaces. But still, I was left, even after doing all this, I've been left with the question of what are the queer histories of cartography? How do we think about cartography in a way that is different? How do we think about the practice of cartography in ways that are different? And so to figure that out, I started back in 2019, and I continue to do so, building a collection of queer maps and travel guides. So I kind of scour eBay and other used bookstores looking for these older queer travel guides to understand how these depictions of space and place have changed over time. So some of these are quite kind of cartographically garish. So this is from my collection. It's a 1976 gay map of London. It's one of the first maps of London post decriminalization of homosexuality in the late 60s. And as you can see, the cartography is nothing to write home about. Cartographically speaking, this would not be winning any major awards. But what is so fascinating about it is that the author used a pseudonym. So the name used was Peter Sturdivant, and as far as I can tell, and with some others I've consulted with, there was no individual by the name of Peter Sturdivant living in anywhere in the United Kingdom during the 1970s. So clearly there was a cartographer behind this, but somebody did not want to be identified with it. Other examples that I came across are this much larger line of queer maps known as the David James Press. Their maps were somewhat, I'll use the term institutionalized. So this was a formal business that for about 30 years made maps and gay travel guides in the form of a map for major North American cities. And so their cartography too is an example of individuals who were queer cartographers doing this sort of work. David James himself unfortunately passed away very early on in the AIDS epidemic. And so that was taken on by other folks, but trying to find who those folks were and if they're still around has been a bit difficult. And so what I came to realize was that outside of kind of these two examples of actual queer maps that looked in what we would consider maps, the majority of this information was actually contained in travel guides in textual form. And so these are examples from my collection. Some of them, hopefully no one is insulted by any of these. Some of them are quite actually interesting to kind of deconstruct visually. As a slight aside, the 1991 guide you see on the left is celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is interesting in so many other ways, which I can't get into. But regardless, the way in which these guides present geographic information is very much in terms of textual listings. As you can see, there is a map in the lower right, in the image in the right-hand corner, but they're not particularly innovative. They're just kind of basic maps with numbers on them. It's nothing fancy. And so while critical GIS and critical cartography has done a great job of deconstructing maps, of deconstructing the process of data abstraction, so that would be cartographic generalization, the techniques that we use to make maps, and deconstructing the process of data collection to make it more fair, I think that there is still a need for a queer approach to cartography and a queer approach to the history of cartography. So if we might think of a queer approach to cartography, it embraces difference and diversity. It acknowledges tensions in the mapping process and how sometimes those are not always resolved. It questions the process of how we make maps. And so, unsurprisingly, queer cartography has a very substantial overlap with what is emerging as kind of a feminist cartography and a feminist ethic towards mapping. But I want to say that one area that I think queer cartography and a queer approach to cartography can contribute, and this might be a bit controversial, is a de-emphasis of the explicitly visual. In other words, queer cartography might say, what if we envisioned things that were maps that didn't look like maps? What if we opened cartography up not only to be the study of maps as we traditionally think about them, but also of travel guides, of other forms of geographic, of ways to display and move and collect geographic information? If we stopped essentially looking completely at the visual and looked at other forms of ways to display information. And so with the limited time that I have left, I want to give a quick example of this in practice. So this is another item from my collection. It's a travel guide independently produced in 1974, entitled "Which Way Do You Go?" So what I paid $20 for this, and it came with not only the guide itself, but a 1975 update. So it talked about some changes that had occurred. This very nice business card, and this image on the bottom right-hand corner, which I think is one of the campiest but most haunting images I have seen of the author who had moved homes, but had obscured his face so that you couldn't actually figure out who he was. And so what's so interesting about this guide is the fact that the author claims to have visited every single place that he is writing about. And so this is kind of best seen in the 1975 guide. So the 1975 update to the guide has 10 pages. He claims to have visited more than 19 countries on every continent other than Antarctica in 1975. And when I first purchased this item, I thought, there's no way that this guy actually did this. There's got to be something going on. But with a little bit of sleuthing, I was able to actually find out that the name Malcolm Warren, as you see here on the bottom left-hand corner, was actually a pseudonym for an individual known as Richard Warren Brown. And with some more digging, I was able to find a photo of Richard Warren Brown from the early 1960s. And Richard Warren Brown was not a cartographer. He was not really even a geographer. He was a tour guide for wealthy tourists who wanted to travel the world in the 60s and 70s. And so they would pay him to make travel arrangements so that they could go visit and tour around the world. And as a gay man, he was able to take advantage of that and essentially find all of these and describe all of these different various queer communities across the globe. And so while Richard Warren Brown is not a cartographer by our traditional standards, I would argue that he should be considered a cartographer. He did data collection, he arranged it, he did all sorts of work to essentially catalog and visualize geographic information. The only thing he didn't do was really make it look nice and pretty in a map. And so when I talk about queer maps and mapping queerly, my hope is that we can, as a cartographic community, kind of expand beyond our traditional notions of the map to think about other ways and other folks who might be very adjacent to what we envision as cartography, but are very much involved in the process of collecting and displaying geographic information. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thanks so much for coming, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.